starting out in the first verse 1, even the first, and we know the word covenant isn't there again, right? Eke min ukai he prote. The first had regulations for worship in an earthly place of holiness. There's a tent prepared. The first section even tells us here, right out the Greek word is really tent, the skene in the Greek, right there. But then he simply says the first again, the first what? The first section. Here we go with the prote right there again. In comparison to the second section, right, which we read in verse 3. So I'm not going to go into detail about these particular parts because this isn't particularly extremely important for our midrash that we're drawing on tonight for tonight's study. He's simply making the readers aware, which they would have been aware, right? They were Hebrews, that's the letter's name. They understood this a little bit better than many of us Christians do because we don't study the Old Testament the way we should. But they understood this. 2 sections to the earthly tabernacle, right? First section, second section. And from this, he draws their attention to the fact that there were regulations, right? And when we get to move to verse 6, he says, the priests go regularly into the first section. Notice there are some details. Number 1, there are many priests, multiple, that go regularly into this first section. But in verse 7, into the second, right, the Deuteron, the second section, which is the Holy of Holies, only the high priest goes. And he only goes once a year. So notice the contrast, just using the earthly tabernacle. He says that the many priests minister daily, meaning there's many of them and they do their duties many, many times. But in contrast, in verse 7, there's only one person who only goes into this place exclusively and only then once a year. So notice the contrast not only between the number of priests, but in the frequency in which they go into these places. So the writer to the book of Hebrews uses this truth found in the Torah, right? You can read about these details in the Torah itself. He uses these to demonstrate this reality about the fact that here on earth, the earthly priests as a whole could never bring us to this perfect state, because the fact that there was repetition of their sacrifices demonstrated that the perfection had not been reached. The very repetition of the sacrifices on an earthly level, at a ritual level, demonstrated that perfection was not attained, right? Recall those 2 parts that I mentioned, Hebrews 7:11. Now if perfection had been attainable, right? And Hebrews 8 verse 7, for if that first covenant had been faultless. In context, the writer's trying to get us to understand that on an earthly level, ritual atonement had its limitations, and there were multiple priests that could only do something at a ritual level. But in contrast, we have a heavenly high priest, namely Yeshua, who has entered into the heavenlies, the Holy of Holies in the heavens, once, exclusively, for all time, and in doing so, he has brought us to that goal.